On a summer morning in 1980, hundreds of children gathered on a Nottinghamshire hillside for what should have been an ordinary day of marching bands and sunshine. But then, without warning, children began collapsing. One after another, they fell dizzy, nauseous, unable to stand. Some blacked out where they stood. Parents panicked. Ambulances rushed in. No one knew what was happening. And by the end of the day, one of the strangest mass sickness events in British history had begun.
ID Tech is more than just the original and most trusted tech camp for kids ages 7 to 17. ID Tech is where kids find their people, the engineering and creating people, the fire-breathing, shell-spinning BattleBots people, the just as happy building games as they are playing them people. ID Tech offers over 50 epic courses, like Camp Crunch Labs IRL, BattleBots with Take-Home Bots, and more at 75 college campuses across the country. Visit idtech.com and use code IDTech to save $150 on a week that's guaranteed to be the highlight of your kid's summer.
Here's a tip for you. There's a podcast out there with fans waiting to be your next customer. They tune in every week, they trust the host, and that host wants to talk about brands like yours in their own words to their audience. The problem is, you just haven't been introduced yet. We're Acast, where that introduction happens. As the world's largest podcast marketplace, we let you browse shows, see who's listening, and book host-read sponsorships or run your own ads all from one platform. Transparent pricing, real-time data, complete control. Start advertising on podcasts by visiting acast.com/advertise.
ID Tech is more than just the original and most trusted tech camp for kids ages 7 to 17. ID Tech is where kids find their people, the engineering and creating people, the fire-breathing, shell-spinning BattleBots people, the just as happy building games as they are playing them people. ID Tech offers over 50 epic courses, like Camp Crunch Labs IRL, BattleBots with Take-Home Bots, and more at 75 college campuses across the country. Visit idtech.com and use code IDTech to save $150 on a week that's guaranteed to be the highlight of your kid's summer.
Geico presents a 30-second podcast between your podcast. Today's story is shared by one of our listeners. It's called Betrayed by Bill. It was in that moment I caught who was staring back at me in betrayal, or more like what? My insurance bill. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and switched to Geico, saving about $900 in the process, and never to be betrayed again. Now that was bloody riveting.
It feels good when the story ends with savings. It feels good to Geico.
Hello, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Toby.
And welcome to the Whispering Woods podcast. This episode is all about
The Hollinwell incident.
Yeah, so I've got most of the episode is about the incident, and then I've got a few more bits about Nottinghamshire itself. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/The Whispering Woods, where we have a number of tiers, and for a small monthly fee, you can listen ad-free. We're also on Apple Premium. I'm running out of breath. We're also on Apple Premium, and come and say hi on social media. You can also support us too by rating and reviewing. For a note now. Right. Are you ready for the story?
Yes, I am.
On a summer morning in July 1980, a large group of children gathered on open ground near the village of Hollinwell Showground, an area of wide grassland used for local events, community gatherings, and outdoor competitions, where the landscape opens out just enough to hold several hundred people without ever feeling overcrowded. Bordered by trees and low rises that give the space a sense of separation from the surrounding villages, without placing it entirely beyond them. The event itself was nothing out of the ordinary. It was a marching band competition attended by children from across the region, many of them part of school or youth bands, dressed in uniform, carrying instruments, moving through rehearsed routines that required coordination and timing, all of which depended on maintaining a steady rhythm in what was, by all accounts, warm but otherwise unremarkable weather. Families were present, organisers were in place. Nothing about the setup suggested anything beyond a typical day. At the centre of the field, groups of children assembled in formation, waiting their turn to perform, while others stood at the edges, watching, adjusting uniforms, preparing to move when called. The atmosphere, according to later accounts, was calm and routine, and for a time, everything proceeded as expected. Then gradually, something began to change. Child, feeling unwell, another complaining of dizziness, someone stepping out of formation. At this stage, there was no clear pattern, no indication that anything beyond ordinary discomfort was taking place, particularly given the number of children present and the physical nature of what they were doing, which made isolated instances of fatigue or lightheadedness easy to explain. But the number began to increase, and within a short period of time, what had been scattered and individual became something else completely. Children were collapsing, not one or two, but several, then more. Reports describe participants becoming suddenly unsteady, losing their balance and falling without warning, some appearing disorientated, others unable to stand, with symptoms that included dizziness, nausea, and in some cases, temporary loss of consciousness. The shift was rapid, enough that those overseeing the event began to recognise that this was no longer a series of unrelated incidents. Something was going on, and whatever it was affecting multiple people at once. The field, which had been organised and controlled only minutes earlier, began to change. As groups break formation, attention shifted away from performance and toward those who had fallen, and the scale of the situation became increasingly difficult to ignore. Emergency services were called, and the ambulances began to arrive. Children were moved away from the centre of the field, laid down where space allowed, monitored by adults who at that point had no clear understanding of what they were dealing with. By the time the situation stabilised, around 300 people had been affected, most of them children. And despite the number involved, despite the speed at which it had developed, and despite the fact that it had taken place in a contained outdoor environment, there was no immediate explanation for what had caused it. What made the incident at Hollinwell Showground so difficult to understand was not simply the number of people affected, but the way the symptoms appeared, spread, and then just as suddenly seemed to stabilise without leaving behind a clear cause. By the time the emergency services had fully responded, the scale of the situation had become apparent, with ambulances arriving in succession and local hospitals preparing to receive a large number of patients, many of them children who only a short time earlier had been standing in formation on an open field. The symptoms reported were broadly consistent across those affected. Although not identical in severity, many described a sudden onset of dizziness, the kind that does not build gradually but arrives quickly, accompanied by nausea, weakness, and a sense of disorientation that made it difficult to remain standing, and in some cases impossible. Others experienced headaches, blurred vision, or a sensation described in later accounts as lightness in the body, as though balance had been disrupted rather than simply lost. Some children collapsed, others were able to sit or lie down before the symptoms worsened. A smaller number briefly lost consciousness. What stood out to those on the ground was the speed. There had been no warning of what was about to happen. Instead, it appeared to emerge almost simultaneously in different groups, affecting children who were not standing together, who were not interacting closely, and who, in many cases, belonged to different bands that had travelled from separate locations. No immediate indication of anything in the air or on the ground that might explain what was happening. And yet the symptoms continued to appear. Children were assisted away from the main area and laid out on the grass or moved toward temporary shelter, where volunteers and organisers attempted to keep them calm and monitor their condition while waiting for medical teams to take over. Despite the severity of the initial onset, one detail began to solidify that would later complicate efforts to understand the incident. Most of those affected began to recover relatively quickly. By the time they reached hospital, many of the children were already improving, their symptoms easing without the need for intensive treatment. And while some required observation and supportive care, there were no immediate signs of long-term harm. This pattern, sudden onset, widespread impact, and relatively rapid recovery, did not align neatly with many of the more obvious explanations. If it had been food-related, the timing likely would have been more staggered. If it had been heat-related, the symptoms might have been expected to develop more gradually. If it had been a clearly identifiable toxin, there would likely have been more consistent or prolonged effects. Instead, what remained was a collection of symptoms that had affected hundreds of people in a confined period of time, in an open-air environment. Medical staff began the process of assessment, gathering accounts, checking for common factors, and looking for any detail that might connect those who had been affected. But as the initial response gave way to investigation, it became increasingly clear that whatever had happened on that field had not left behind the kind of evidence that would make it easy to explain. Medical teams examined those affected, noting consistent symptoms that included dizziness, nausea, fainting, and in some cases, irritation to the eyes and throat, while investigators began to consider whether anything in the surrounding environment could account for such a widespread and sudden reaction, particularly given that the event had taken place outdoors. Initial theories focused on contamination. Food and drink were tested and quickly ruled out, as many of the children had brought their own supplies, and no common source could be identified, while attention then shifted toward the possibility of an airborne cause, specifically the idea that a chemical cloud may have passed over the showground, exposing those present to something that had not been immediately visible. This line of inquiry gained traction at the time, but failed to produce a definitive result. Local reports suggested that nearby fields had not been sprayed recently, and wind direction on that day did not support the idea that anything could have drifted across the site in a way that would account for the pattern observed, leaving the theory unconfirmed despite its initial plausibility. Other suggestions were also considered, including environmental factors and physical strain, but none provided a complete explanation for which symptoms appeared or in the way in which recovery seemed to follow quickly. Mass psychogenic illness, the idea that symptoms may have spread through the group without a single physical trigger, moving instead through shared experience, perception, or reaction, particularly within a large gathering of young people under structured conditions. This explanation was ultimately adopted as the official conclusion, but it did not fully settle the matter. Because alongside the formal investigation, there were other details that continued to circulate, not as part of the official findings, but as part of the wider reporting and discussions that followed. Among them was a report noted at the time in the press that police had investigated claims of a UFO landing in a field near the event site in the days surrounding the incident. No evidence of such a landing was ever found, and no connection between that report and the events at Hollinwell was established. But the fact that it was considered, even briefly, reflects the uncertainty that surrounded the investigation as a whole, and the extent to which no single explanation fully accounted for what had taken place. By the time the inquiry concluded, there was no confirmed containment, no identified environmental cause, and no consensus that satisfied everyone who had witnessed what happened that day. What remained was the record: hundreds affected, an open field, a normal morning, and an event that began without warning, spread rapidly, and ended without leaving behind a clear reason for why it had happened at all. What makes the events at Hollinwell Showground difficult to leave behind is not only what happened on that day, but what was reported in the days and weeks that followed. Because instead of closing the incident, the aftermath appeared to extend it in ways that are harder to define. In the immediate sense, most of those affected recovered quickly. Children who had been taken to hospital were discharged, many within hours. There were no lasting physical effects identified, which might have suggested a contained and temporary episode. But that was not the end of it. Reports began to emerge of symptoms returning, not at the showground but elsewhere. Some of the children who had already been treated and sent home were readmitted after experiencing similar symptoms again, despite being removed from the original environment, which raised questions about whether the cause, whatever it had been, could be tied solely to that location. And then there were additional incidents. Within days, individuals in nearby areas, people who had not been present at the showground, reported symptoms that closely resembled those seen at Hollinwell, including dizziness, nausea, and fainting, occurring in separate settings and under different conditions, but described in ways that aligned closely. In one case, members of a band connected to the original event collapsed again during a separate march, an incident that was later attributed to factors such as heat and physical exertion, although the similarity in symptoms did not go unnoticed at the time. Elsewhere, smaller groups of children were taken ill in different parts of the region, some requiring hospital treatment, with explanations ranging from heat exhaustion to fatigue. But again, the pattern, young people, sudden onset, similar symptoms, continued to appear. These later incidents were not formally linked as part of a single event. They were treated individually, explained where possible, closed where necessary, but taken together, they created a continuation of the original uncertainty because they suggested that whatever had occurred at Hollinwell did not sit entirely within the boundaries of that one day. If the original incident had been caused by something physical, something environmental, then why did similar symptoms appear elsewhere, under different conditions, after the fact? And if it had been psychological, something that spread through shared experience, then how did it extend beyond those who had been present? One suggestion, raised at the time, was that later cases may have been influenced by awareness of the original event, a form of secondary response shaped by knowledge of what had happened. Although this did not fully account for every report, particularly those involving individuals with no direct connection to the showground. As with the original incident, there was no single explanation that resolved all of these details. What remained instead was a series of connected moments, each one understandable in isolation, but more difficult to place when viewed together. An initial event affecting hundreds, followed by smaller separate incidents, all sharing the same basic characteristics and all occurring within a relatively short period of time. By the end of it, the official position had not changed. The incident of Hollinwell remained classified as a case of mass psychogenic illness. The later events were explained individually, and the wider pattern was left without a single unifying cause. There are incidents that can be explained, even if the explanation is complicated, and then there are those that settle into something less defined, where the official conclusion exists, but does not quite bring the event to a close. What happened at Hollinwell Showground in July of 1980 falls into that second category. Because while the term mass psychogenic illness provides a framework, a way of understanding how symptoms might spread through a group without a single physical cause, it does not fully account for the experience as it was described by those who were there, nor does it sit comfortably with every detail that followed. Even the details that sit at the edges of the story, the reports of unusual smells, the descriptions of the air feeling different, the mention, however brief, of something seen in the sky or in the nearby fields, remain exactly that. Details, recorded, considered, and then left without conclusion. The showground still exists. The land has not changed in any way that would suggest what happened there once. People pass through it, stand on it, cross it without noticing anything unusual. And yet the incident remains part of its history, not because it was resolved, but because it really was not. Because even now, more than 40 years later, the question has not entirely gone away. Not what happened, but why it happened in the way that it did, and why, despite the number of people involved, despite the attention it received, and despite the investigations that followed, the answer has never been fully agreed upon, which leaves the event where it has remained since that day, documented, explained, and still, in some quiet way, unresolved. And if there's one thing Nottinghamshire has never lacked, it's stories. Long before the Hollinwell children collapsed beneath that summer sky, this county had already built a quiet reputation for strange lights and events that never seemed to settle into neat explanations. Across its villages, market towns, and stretches of woodland, people have always claimed that something odd lingers. Some of those stories reach back centuries. During the Battle of Stoke in 1487, witnesses described unusual lights seen above the battlefield, bright enough to be remembered long after the fighting stopped. Later writers would suggest sunlight catching armour or unusual atmospheric conditions, but those who saw them believed they had witnessed something extraordinary. By the 20th century, that language had changed, but the feeling had not. In 1954, residents near Hucknall reported a strange machine hovering in the air, a craft unlike anything they recognised. Rumours of a flying saucer quickly followed. The truth turned out to be a Rolls-Royce flying bedstead, an experimental vertical takeoff aircraft under test nearby. What looked impossible from the ground was simply technology arriving before the public had caught up. Then came the great UFO wave of the 1970s, when sightings were reported across Britain, and Nottinghamshire was no exception. Local investigators logged glowing objects, orange spheres, hovering lights and fast-moving shapes crossing the night sky. Silver Hill Pit became a popular vantage point for skywatchers, with people gathering in the dark hoping to witness something unexplained. And the reports did not stop there. Freedom of information requests in the last decade revealed that Nottinghamshire police had continued receiving calls involving ghosts, witches, strange lights and unexplained disturbances. In Ashfield, dozens of reports described suspected witchcraft or rituals. Other calls concerned people convinced their homes were haunted, that unseen forces were moving objects, or that figures had been seen where no one should have been. In 1 year, police records showed a sharp rise in witchcraft-related reports in parts of the county. Officers stressed there was no evidence of occult crime, and many of the calls were likely misunderstandings, neighbour disputes, pranks, or people experiencing fear during already stressful situations. Paranormal groups also added to the county's modern folklore. Investigators walking the Traversal Trail spoke of sudden dread, the sensation of being watched, and hearing whispered names in the trees. Visitors to Wollerton Hall have described cold spots, footsteps in empty rooms, and glimpses of a woman in period dress, said to resemble Lady Middleton. At Newstead Abbey, staff and guests have long told stories of doors closing on their own, voices in corridors and figures passing through candlelit rooms. And perhaps that is why Hollinwell still unsettles people, because whatever happened in that field in July 1980 belongs to the same long Nottinghamshire tradition of events. No proven curse was found, no secret experiment was uncovered, no supernatural force emerged from the trees, but the mystery remained. And in a county where strange lights were once seen over battlefields, UFOs are still constantly reported, and police in modern times still received calls about witches and hauntings. Sometimes the thing that lingers is not a ghost at all. It's the question that never quite goes away.
ID Tech is more than just the original and most trusted tech camp for kids ages 7 to 17. ID Tech is where kids find their people, the engineering and creating people, the fire-breathing, shell-spinning BattleBots people, the just as happy building games as they are playing them people. ID Tech offers over 50 epic courses, like Camp Crunch Labs IRL, BattleBots with Take-Home Bots, and more at 75 college campuses across the country. Visit idtech.com and use code IDTech to save $150 on a week that's guaranteed to be the highlight of your kid's summer.
For a small business owner, every day is full of surprises. Some great, some not so great. Like when a client cancels their order at the last minute. But here's a surprise you will like. Progressive provides small business owners with 30 customizable coverage options to help keep their business going strong. So go ahead, surprise yourself. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates and third-party insurers. Coverage is not available in all states or for all vehicles and coverage selections.
Intriguing, isn't it? What do you think?
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of that film where all the one night all the kids just ran off.
Oh yeah, weapons.
Everyone just ran away.
Weapons.
And it sort of reminds me of the Dancing Plague as well.
Yeah. Those kind of psycho things.
Yeah.
I can't think of the word now. My brain's gone.
Psychic.
No. Not psychotic either. But yeah, I just can't. My brain's hurting today. There's so many. What I find interesting is the reports of there actually being a UFO being seen at the time or close to the date, and that they've looked into whether it was like chemicals on the fields and stuff like that, and none of that. It was none of those things. So mass hysteria. That's what I was trying to think of. Mass hysteria, possibility, but I don't know with mass hysteria. I'm not a believer. Look at me disproving something that is psychologically proven. And I'm like, no, it doesn't exist.
I don't know what is.
Basically, when somebody believes something and then it spreads. So it's like a brain thing. So like with the dancing plague, somebody believed they can't stop dancing. And then because the next person who's with
Placebo,
kind of, in a way, if you believe something is happening. Yeah?
Yeah.
It's just very brain powerful stuff. And I do remember an occasion when we all went camping to the Black Mountains when we were teenagers, and we all thought we were possessed.
Yeah, I know. I used to get that as well with the camps. Yeah. Everybody was telling themselves that we seen somebody, and somebody went up. Like, we think we actually seen somebody, but when deep down we all know it was just like...
Yeah.
But then, we've actually seen someone.
You all get carried away with it, don't you?
Yeah, but it's fun, innit?
Yeah, it is. And we were doing like an exorcism on Anti-Rach. Because we went to this graveyard, which is just across from the field, and it was really, really, nobody was there. It was really, what's the word I'm looking for? Quiet. Not quiet, but really out in the sticks of nowhere.
Eerie.
There was a church, and we went there, and there was, I still remember it to this day, there was a grave of a little girl called Dina or Dinah, and then we thought she came back with us, and then Auntie Rachel got possessed, and we just had to shake it out of her, and she was like, go on. We had fun though.
Funny. Well, that's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch up with you again soon.
We will indeed. I'll catch you on Thursday for the Reddit and listener story episode, and then again on Sunday for the After Dark. Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.
Geico presents a 30-second podcast between your podcast. Today's story is shared by one of our listeners. It's called Betrayed by Bill. It was in that moment I caught who was staring back at me in betrayal, or more like what? My insurance bill. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and switched to Geico, saving about $900 in the process, and never to be betrayed again. Now that was bloody riveting.
It feels good when the story ends with savings. It feels good to Geico.
While every other channel is fighting for your customers' attention, podcasts are where they've already given it. No one accidentally listens to a podcast for 45 minutes. They choose to be here. They trust the voice in their ears, and when that voice talks about your brand, it doesn't sound like advertising. It sounds like a recommendation from a friend. Acast gives you that trust at scale. Digital precision, host-read authenticity, and performance data that proves it worked. Don't fight for attention. Buy it with Acast. Learn more by visiting acast.com/advertise.
The stories told on the Whispering Woods are inspired by historical records, witness reports, and local folklore. While every effort is made to research and represent events accurately, some details, names, and locations may differ from official accounts or have been changed out of respect for those involved. These episodes are created for storytelling and entertainment purposes and should not be considered definitive fact or investigative journalism.